Okay, welcome back. We're now on the third PowerPoint of Vietnam, and we left off with the Geneva Conference of 1954 decision to have elections in 2 years, and then never having elections, and then people in Vietnam starting to get upset. So in this PowerPoint, we're going to look at the Vietnam War beginning, or as they call it in Vietnam, the American War. The American War. So let's start with how in the South there was major opposition to the South Vietnamese government. The South Vietnamese government, like I said, they were French influenced. They spoke French. They very much supported the same business elite of the French, and they were Catholic, and they were a puppet government. A lot of people felt like their rights, they weren't allowed to have their rights, they weren't allowed economic freedom, they weren't allowed religious freedom. In fact, in this picture right here, you see a Buddhist monk who is, he has set fire to himself. Self-immolation is what that's called, and he is setting fire to himself in protest of the government, saying that, Buddhists don't have the right to practice under this government, and they want to get rid of the government. Now, normally, Buddhist monks are not into politics at all. They stay away from politics. But here you have Buddhist monks getting into politics, and they're hoping that the world will see them. They're hoping that the media will watch them, so that American people will see, like, this government is not popular. Stop supporting this government. Now, they even, they didn't speak any English, but they would get signs up that would say, get rid of this government, we stop supporting this government, and they would hold these signs up when they saw journalists around. And, when Americans would see this image, it's a very famous image of this monk burning himself, they could see how desperate people there must be, and they started to question, why are we supporting this government? At the same time that the South Vietnamese government is very unpopular and is getting attention around the world for being unpopular, and at the same time, communist guerrilla troops in the north start to slowly go into the south to get the south back, and they get support of the people. A lot of peasants support the communist troops in the north, and they start to control large areas of the countryside. So the U.S. government, by the late 1950s, is seeing, like, even though they were able to avoid an election, that the South Vietnamese government might not last very long anyway, because the north is going in and taking countryside area, and people are not happy with the South Vietnamese government. So the U.S. government makes a decision. It looks like the north is going to take over the South Vietnamese government, and so the South Vietnamese government, there's a coup. A coup, as you remember, is the military takes over the leader of the country, the South Vietnamese puppet government, and they actually assassinate him and they kill him. And then they put in another South Vietnamese puppet government, basically. It's now known that the U.S. was actually involved in the coup and the assassination. They knew this was going to happen, and they let it happen because they saw that the leader they had chosen was unpopular, and they wanted to put in a different leader. Now, President John F. Kennedy was president at the time, and you have to remember what was going on. He had just suffered a very humiliating defeat with Cuba in the Bay of Pigs, which we already talked about, and people thought that, he was losing very badly to the communists, and this could look really bad, and so he thought a way to save the government would be to put in a new a better puppet government, basically. So the South Vietnamese government is a mess. They just had a coup. Their leader's just killed. The North is still involved. I mean, it looks bad. President Kennedy is assassinated, and President Johnson is the new president. And under President Johnson, that's when the U.S. officially gets involved in the war. What happened was, American troops had been involved in the war for a long time, involved in Vietnam for a long time as advisors. Since the 1950s, since the French were there, we've been sending money, weapons, advice, people as advisors, and the military was slowly growing in number. But we were not involved in war in Vietnam, and we couldn't get involved in war because, you have to declare an act of war, and the Congress has to support it, and you have to say, fine, we're at war. But you can't just declare a war with a country because you're not happy that they might become communist. Like, it's not a good enough excuse. People don't want to go to war unless, unless they're attacked or something really bad happens. President Johnson has become president because President Kennedy died and President Johnson, or he was assassinated, President Johnson was the vice president. But elections are coming up, and he's running against a man who is very conservative and who's very tough on communism and who wants to bomb. He wants to. He's talked about using bombs against communists. And he's talked about making sure that South Vietnam does not fall to communism. So, in 1964, there is President Johnson comes forward and says that a U.S. ship has been attacked, in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is a gulf right next to Vietnam, and he says that the ships were doing their routine of going by when they were fired on by North Vietnamese ships. And so President Johnson gets the Congress to authorize going to war with Vietnam, and that's when war begins. This is called the Gulf of Tonkin, right here, right? The Gulf of Tonkin incident. And this is when you start getting all these troops. Here's a popular movie at the time called The Green Berets, starring John Wayne, where American troops are shown kind of as cowboy heroes in Vietnam, saving the day, saving the Vietnamese from the communists and helping them bring freedom. And at the time, there was a very popular song called The Green Berets that everybody would listen to on the radio about how great the U.S. troops were. And it was very much just feeling like it was World War II again. Like we were saving the world from the Nazis. We were going to save the world from the communists. We were the strongest country in the world. We had the most weapons, the most military. We had been attacked. How dare they attack us? We're going to go in there and we're going to win, and it's going to be quick because they're Vietnam and they're very poor, and we're the U.S. and we're the most powerful country in the world. That's the idea. Everybody was on board. This was a popular movie at the time, The Green Berets. People went and watched it and were excited. Interestingly enough, The Green Berets was funded by the U.S. government, and so was the song. So this is basically propaganda for war. What later came out about 10 years later is that the Gulf of Tonkin incident did not happen. There was firing of ships, but it was not unprovoked. The U.S. ship had provoked firing against them, so it wasn't just the attack out of nowhere. It was a defense attack. They had been fired. The North Vietnamese troops had been fired on, and the U.S. troops then fired back. And these documents came out about 10 years later. So at the time in 1964, Americans were told. The Congress was told that they were attacked, but in fact, this was not the case. So it's kind of interesting now when you think about when the government says we have to go to war. It's even if the president says it, you should question what are the sources. How do we know this? Because it's happened before where we went to war when it wasn't really for the reason that we were told. So in 1964, we went to war to stop this communist threat. And you can't ignore also that President Johnson had a tough re-election coming up, and he wanted to show that he was tough on communism. So he was reelected, and when he was reelected, he said, this war is going to end very quickly, and we will get our troops out, and we will save South Vietnam. We will let them be free and independent and not be taken over by the North. Here are two quotes. One is from President Kennedy, JFK, John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy. He said, when he was president, "For the last decade, we have been helping the South Vietnamese to maintain their independence, for giving reasons for why the U.S. was in South Vietnam and helping them become not having them be taken over by the North Vietnamese communist troops." When President Johnson was president, he said, "We want nothing for ourselves, only that the people of South Vietnam will be allowed to guide their own country in their own way." So what do you notice in these two quotes? Both presidents are saying that all they want is for the South Vietnamese to be independent and to be able to choose for themselves. Now, this is very interesting because if you look back at the history in Vietnam, when Vietnam did want to be independent and choose for themselves, the U.S. ignored them. Later on, they're saying the reason that they're there is to help them be independent. So the reasons kind of change over the years, and you have to question why are we there? Yes, the Cold War ideas were very strong at the time, and this is what was going on. This is this fear of communism that had sort of become so strong that people were sort of ignoring kind of the facts of the history of how we had started to get involved there. years started to go by, and, you know, the United States had the best army in the world. They had the most money, but they were still not winning in Vietnam. And this idea that the war was going to end, and you know, we were going to save South Vietnam and come back very quickly, did not happen. You know, this picture right here is a famous picture. It's a town has been, or a village has been bombed by the Americans, and they're using napalm, which is this chemical that can burn your skin, and these are little kids running away from it. And this is, someone takes this photo, and this photo is then sent out in the U.S., and Americans are seeing this, and they're saying, what kind of war is going on over there? Why are little kids, you know, running? What kind of protection are we giving for those people? So, you know, the war starts to become unpopular in America. And also, you know, why aren't we winning? Because we're fighting against guerrilla warfare. The North Vietnamese troops, they know the jungle. We are unfamiliar with the jungle terrain. They know the people. The people are protecting them. The South Vietnamese government is not popular, so the people don't want to help them. And the U.S. is just bombing. They're using all their bombs to just bomb acres and acres of farmland and forests. And the more bombing that happens, the more the peasants are opposed to the U.S. forces. They see the destruction that they're bringing, and they will not support them. So this is sort of why the U.S. is not winning the war. And I'm going to leave this, I'm going to end this PowerPoint now, and this is the end of PowerPoint 3. Come back, listen to PowerPoint 4, and learn what happens, why the U.S. ends up staying in Vietnam for so long, even though they're losing, and how the war eventually ends. All right.